Welcome to MMT Chats. This episode is brought to you by ISCAR with new ideas for machining intelligently. Welcome to another quick MMT chat. I'm Christina Fugis with MoldMaking Technology, and my guest today is Mark Gauvain, who is a manufacturing and tooling business development executive, basically an industry consultant based in Boston, Massachusetts. And he is also one of MoldMaking Technology's editorial advisory board members. Mark is here to lend some insight on a topic I've been asked about very recently, namely NDAs. So hello, Mark.
Hey, Christina, how are you?
Good. So a few readers, as I've said, have reached out to me recently seeking guidance and insight on non-disclosure agreements and manufacturing service agreements as legal contracts. So I guess to get right into this, can you define what an NDA is versus an MSA?
Yeah, well, an NDA, as I think many people might know in the business, is it's simply a confidentiality agreement. And essentially two parties that are agreeing to share non-public information. So that might be material, it might be CAD files, designs, product information. So two companies doing business together, and they wish to keep this information private between themselves. So that seems fairly simple, but oftentimes, NDAs, particularly if you're working with, a large corporation, say a Fortune 500 company, or even like a tier one contract manufacturing group, a lot of elements, legal, contractual elements, and risk for small businesses are actually embedded into some of these NDAs. So that's something to be aware of. Yeah.
So what's an MSA?
So an MSA is, there are different acronyms for these.
Right.
Different industries can refer to them as slightly different, but an MSA is a manufacturing services agreement. So that's essentially a wide-ranging umbrella, contract between a manufacturer and a customer, like an OEM or a product company, or even again like a tier one manufacturer who's subcontracting work to the smaller manufacturing company.
Okay, all right. So mold builders can have a multitude of these agreements out there, and it seems that there's a lack of understanding of their nature, their legitimacy after a designated amount of time or a number of conversations, et cetera. And it can be a real burden, especially on the small shop. So again, recently readers expressed there's actually anxiety they feel every time they're asked to sign one, especially again if they're small.
Yeah, with NDAs, they're very common. Oftentimes a small manufacturing company, whether they're a tool maker or an injection molding firm, just to participate in the RFQ process, just to quote business, you're processing a lot of NDAs. And it's like many other things, it's best to keep them simple.
Yep.
A mutual NDA, a one-page NDA generally is sufficient and serves its purpose, particularly for a smaller company. Some NDAs could be, 10, 12, 20 pages. They become like extensive contracts themselves. But my message to some of the small tool makers or some of the smaller companies out there is it's best to keep it simple. One page generally is all you need to ensure that, you're covering both parties. It's essentially a bilateral type agreement.
Okay. All right. So to keep this simple, I know you've expressed to me there are 12 deadly sins, as you like to call them, these agreements, or 12 things to consider, right? So why don't you just run through these?
That's what I call them, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek there, but they certainly could be damaging to, in a worst-case scenario, damaging to certain enterprises and businesses. That's why it's important that they're highlighted, and you make your team, whether that's operations managers or a sales manager or a VP or ultimately the P&L owner of the business, oftentimes are negotiating these, and it has direct correlation to how well the business is going to do in the relationship with the customer. So so the 12 deadly sins, the first one which we come across, and these are in no particular order,
Okay.
but there's 12 of them. And again, some of these end up in NDAs. Many of these elements will be embedded in clauses throughout, what would be a manufacturing contract. And the first one is epidemic failure. And one thing with the 12 deadly sins is this two dimensions to this that a small manufacturer should have. There should be a standard position. So that is essentially where, you have that standard position regardless of who the end customer is or regardless of what type of business you're quoting. The second dimension is actually a fallback position, just like anything else where there's negotiation involved, you're giving a little bit and getting a little bit in return. There may be a fallback position where you're able to give a little bit back. So it's imperative that there are two positions across these 12 deadly sins. These positions need to be set by these companies. This is what I recommend. And then ultimately moving from the standard to the fallback position, there should be an approval loop. It might just be, the CEO of the company, or it could be the business owner, or again, the person responsible for the P&L. So there should be an approval process moving from standard to fallback. So epidemic failure, essentially the standard position, it should be for smaller companies is there's no liability for an epidemic failure other than, repair and replace. So say a manufacturer is producing a part, molding a part, and there's a problem with a dimension. And that goes across a days of production or weeks worth of production. That could be declared an epidemic failure. It's something that's in the process, right? There should be no liability other than repair and replace that product. Now, a fallback position would be if, say, the customer is looking for more in this category. Perhaps you would agree to, transportation of the material, sorting, or batching. But again, that would be subject to like a liability cap, which I can get to at the end. Liability cap is actually one of the deadly sins itself. So that's epidemic failure. The second would be indemnification, and this is one of the most important ones. Indemnification essentially is the obligation of one party to compensate for the loss incurred to the other party. And essentially it stems from insurance contracts actually, where it's protection from financial loss. So a lot of companies will push for indemnification because it protects them in the event there's a defect, if there's a problem, whether it's the design or the process. So the first, the standard position should be that there's no liability for any third-party claims. A fallback could be that if the indemnification would be if it's directly caused by a manufacturing breach of warranty due to like gross negligence. Gross negligence is something you can put in there. That's very difficult to prove, and so that actually adds a little bit of protection. So that could be like a fallback as far as indemnification is concerned. An indemnification from third-party claims by the customer. So this is where the customer is bringing a third party where they would have some claims from maybe their end customer or a consumer. The first position for a small manufacturer would be the customer needs to indemnify and defend the manufacturer against all third-party claims that arise out of the manufacturing, distribution, and the sale of the customer's products, right? That's important that you have that in there. If a customer is looking to have indemnification, is actually part of the language. So, and then the fallback would be, again, with the stipulation that it was by manufacturing negligence, right? Which again is very difficult to prove. So it gets a little tricky there, but indemnification is actually one that small companies really should be paying attention to.
Okay.
The fourth deadly sin is late delivery penalties. Oftentimes, large product companies are looking for penalties if you're late to the schedule. Standard position generally should be, there's no delivery penalties at all. It's best effort, essentially.
Okay.
So a fallback would be that the manufacturer is responsible for reasonable costs for, like sorting, perhaps, delivery and so forth. But again, any late delivery penalties, it should be capped by, the overall liability cap.
Okay.
And the fifth one would be termination. Generally, if the small manufacturing company wants to terminate the contract, there's no implications for that. We can, maybe there might be a 30-day or a 90-day advance notice. But termination, the fallback position would be the manufacturer will use commercially reasonable efforts to assist in the transfer of business. If the customer wants to end the business, the manufacturer could extend reasonable efforts to transfer the business at a third party.
Okay.
At customers' costs, essentially. So the sixth one here is really common. It's materials, cancellation, and excess and obsolete inventory, where a standard position would be the customer is responsible for all excess and obsolete inventory if there's any change to the schedule, any change to the product design, et cetera, et cetera. And that includes inventory, finished goods, WIP, that's created by the cancellation of the termination. And generally, there's going to be no fallback, right, on that from the manufacturer's perspective. And then the seventh deadly sin, again, is the warranty, warranty remedy, the warranty period. A standard position, it's common that the manufacturer warrants that the product will meet the specifications and comply with any agreed workmanship standards. That's pretty standard. And if there's an issue, again, repair and replace as the exclusive remedy. Okay. And ideally, there's a time frame for that. It might be one year or 3 years, or whatever it may be. Fallback position, generally, there's not going to be anything more than that, other than maybe refunding the sell price. But generally, manufacturing companies, particularly the small to mid-sized companies, are going to try to avoid and mitigate any kind of warranty liability.
Okay.
The eighth one is component liability. Again, a standard position would be that this manufacturing firm does not directly warrant or indemnify for any components or materials. They're just processing. But a fallback position is that we could, but we would simply pass through warranties that it receives from our supplier. So say we buy some tool steel, there's a problem with the tool steel, we'll pass through that warranty that we get from the tool steel supplier, to our end customer.
Got it.
That's common. The ninth deadly sin is like non-competes or exclusivity.
Yep.
Generally, the standard position is you don't go there, right? We're manufacturing companies. We deal with a number of different customers, different markets. Exclusivity is not what really we want to be getting into, right? Because we're generally a custom molder or a custom mold builder. We don't want to limit ourselves, and there's generally not going to be fallback on that. But customers do look. If you have there's a niche market, end market, and that OEM comes to you and they don't want you building product or building tools for their competitor, they will try to insert an exclusivity clause in these contracts. That's common. See that all the time. The 10th one is intellectual property. Again, the standard position for the small guy should be that the manufacturing company does not warrant IP. And we retain the ownership of all of our intellectual property rights, our IP rights, our processes, things of that nature, where we might have some, tribal knowledge, certain manufacturing techniques. We want to protect that. That is ours, right? And generally, there's not going to be a fallback on that. The 11th deadly sin is, and I've seen this all the time, is guaranteed cost reductions. right? A lot of these large companies, some of these Fortune 500 companies, you're dealing with, procurement teams and supply chain, supply chain organization,
Yep.
and they're looking for guaranteed cost reductions. So generally, the standard position is we don't give guaranteed cost reductions. We'll work on cost improvement and continuous improvement, and we'll consider it once we have business flow and we have some new incremental business. But generally, there's no fallback on that unless it's tied to like an incremental business award or a volume incentive. So we'll give you, and one example would be the manufacturing company would say, we would give you a 10% cost reduction on all the legacy business we have if we're awarded $1 million in new incremental business. So that's a common fallback. And the last deadly sin, the 12th one, again, is one of the most important ones, is a liability cap. It's imperative that if you're working on MSAs, extensive contracts, manufacturing contracts, you need to be able to have a liability cap. So regardless of what happens, if something goes, incredibly sideways, you're able to put in this clause that there is a cap. And that could be a percentage of revenue. Say it's a $1 million of business, and the CEO decides, okay, we'll cap our liability if everything went wrong. Hopefully it doesn't, but our liability would be capped at 20% of revenue. So it'd be $200,000 is, would be the max of damages.
Okay.
So generally you're looking for a percentage of revenue or gross margin in that regard. So those are the 12 sins that we look for that, are often in a lot of these contracts that you get specifically from powerful, large companies that you're trying to do business with.
Yeah. How much negotiation after how much back and forth is there when these things are being asked to be signed?
Yeah, on the NDA level, usually it's quick. Hopefully it's back and forth. It might be 1 or 2 revisions. You like to see that, if there's an honest effort to work together. An NDA is usually a one-time thing, right? It's at the beginning of a new engagement, typically. With contracts, sometimes contracts take months to negotiate, and you may actually have business that you're running while the contract's being negotiated. And then what we'll do is we'll oftentimes create a term sheet, and a term sheet is essentially has like those clauses. It might have 6, 10, 12 of those clauses, and it just simply has, okay, this is the warranty, this is the pricing, this is our engagement, and it had, our delivery schedule, this is the communication we're going to be using, and the term sheet generally is easy to negotiate because there's a lot less language in it. Right?
Okay.
And that generally is like a temporary measure. So, and that could serve as the legal document also in place of an MSA, if there's a desire to use that as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
the
do you have it?
So what I do is with my team, I would put it on a little cheat sheet that's laminated, and I would give it to my business managers, and I'd hand it out to my sales directors, whomever would be negotiating an NDA, or maybe is going to negotiate, a term sheet. You have this as a guideline, for the organization.
Smart. So can you offer any final advice, or is there a particular resource or resources that you would advise our mold builders to, seek out?
Yeah, no, advice that I would give is, each business has a certain risk threshold, right? And just ensure that when you're negotiating these contracts, it may sound simple and straightforward, but ensure that the risk you're taking is commensurate with, the opportunity, right? So if you're $1 million mold builder, and you have like $1 million opportunity, you know, looking at doubling your business with a target. You're willing to take a little bit more risk, right? You're willing to give a little bit back to double the size of your company over, you know, a period of time. So, but whatever risk you take, whatever you're going to give back, whatever leverage you're going to give back through language in these contracts, just ensure that it's commensurate with, you know, the overall opportunity.
Got
it. And you know, the other advice is I'd give is, you know, train your staff who are working on these, and you know, it's not brain surgery, so to speak, right? Once you do a few of these contracts and you're successful doing a few of them, particularly in the manufacturing space where there's more similarity, you know, between agreements, right? So we're kind of staying in our swim lane. But yeah, so you know, you don't necessarily have to go out and retain,
hire a legal team, right?
Exactly, yes, because it's important that, you know, if you're working with the large companies, they have departments full of, you know, legal resources, and that's essentially what you're working against, right? And again, a tier 1 manufacturer who's using a lot of different tool makers and mold makers and so forth, their job is to have the most advantageous contracts, of course, for them. And so as long as you know that going in, and you know, you pay attention to the details, like the 12 deadly sins.
Exactly. That's it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing that. I think it's a great start for people to just get a little more comfortable with what they're dealing with on a daily basis. So again, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem. And to everyone out there, remember, for everything mold making, visit moldmakingtechnology.com.